Sunday last week, Austin and I were playing golf, and the topic of AI came up, and we were just kind of going about it and the back and forth of it. There's a lot of evidence showing that essentially the generation that's in high school right now has almost no ability to write because they so often rely on AI, and there's a lot of fear that essentially it's going to ruin people's ability to think. This isn't anything new. We've seen this discussion a few times over again with the internet, with TV, and all those sorts of things. But what's been interesting is there's a big discussion in some different theological circles about AI in the life of a pastor. And how much should a pastor use it? How much can they rely on it? Those sort of things. There's the warning, of course, that it can do everything for you. So as a pastor, you don't really have to do anything. There are whole examples out there of people who have just had AI write a sermon for them, and that is a possibility. That's something that it can do right now. And the question is how, and the debate, and there was one that actually just happened this last week, 2 weeks ago, on that very topic. How much can the pastor use AI? And as Austin and I were kind of talking back and forth about this and going through things, and as I've been watching this conversation move forward, the thing that hit me is that this is nothing new. It's treated like this new and novel thing, and AI is new and novel in that sense, but the ultimate problem is nothing new. AI can write this whole sermon for me, and you wouldn't know. But just as easily, I could find a sermon online from a pastor, some great preacher, maybe if I'm trying to be sneaky, someone you've never heard of, that way I'm not worried about you finding out. And I could just copy his. In fact, there's been a number of examples of that happening. Prominent preachers who are going through and people connect their sermon put it into AI and search for it, and they found, oh, this person actually just copied almost wholesale somebody else's sermon. It's been going on for a while. In fact, even in the previous generations, different denominations have put out essentially sermon formats. Here, just read this to your people Sunday morning. This idea of AI doing the work for you is nothing new. The church and preachers have been dealing with things like this for many, many generations. How much do we use the internet and searching for things? I know that passage, I know that parable, it's somewhere around in Luke, but Google can find it for me real quick anyway. Am I ruining my memory to learn these things, whatnot? And so when it comes down to the AI thing, there are some people that says, no, as a pastor, you can never touch it, you can't have anything to do with it because it just would make your job too easy. Well, if that's the case, what about the internet? What about commentaries? Is it just making my job too easy? The problem comes down to the pastor and his heart. What is his job in preparing a sermon? And it comes down to the challenge that Paul gave to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2. In verse 15, he says, "Be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth." That's the call in preaching. We're going to look actually at the verses before and after that here in a little bit as part of what we're going to be learning. But it comes down to this. Are you as a pastor going to serve diligently or not? Are you going to present yourself to God as an approved workman? Or one who's lazy? I have the tools and the ability now to research and to understand more about the passage and to see more men's and even women's understanding of these different passages throughout the ages at my fingertips through Google, through the different search programs that I have. To connect different passages and ideas through AI that maybe I would never have thought of otherwise. The tools are not the issue. The heart is. Am I going to present myself to God as an approved workman? Or one who's just being lazy? Or maybe just being prideful as I try to come up with the best ideas, the best understanding of things, to present them in the wisest sounding way. Or to find the best preachers and go, okay, how do they do it? I'm just going to emulate them. I'm just going to copy them. Who am I preaching for? Why am I taking the time to study and understand? That's actually what Paul is going to be focusing on this morning. Our work before God. What kind of worker, what kind of person are you going to be? How are you going to serve? Because ultimately the result is not the issue. The service is. The result is not the issue. The heart and the effort and the love for God is what's at stake. Our truth for this morning comes down to that. The goal of the believer should always and only be faithful service to God. Trusting in Him to use us for His purposes. The same thing I've said over and over again when it comes to children. As parents, we need to reward the effort, not the result. We can see this in maybe two children. One who's just very academically inclined. They're really good at it. They get a B+ just showing up to school. But if they're being lazy, they're not putting in the effort, then as parents we need to drive them further. And punish the laziness even when they get the B+. Because we know they can do better. Where the other student, the other child is working super hard. But they struggle. And that B+ is the result of so much work, so much effort. Then we reward that effort, not the result itself. But with that, let's look at our passage this morning. 1 Corinthians, we're actually going to read a little bit of what we looked at last week. But going from verse 5 down to verse 17. Paul says, "What then is Apollos? And what is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, even as the Lord gave opportunity to each one. I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. So neither then the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but God who causes the growth. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, but each will receive his own reward according to his own labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. According to the grace of God, which was given to me like a wise master builder, I laid a foundation, and another is building on it. But each man must be careful how he builds on it. For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if any man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stone, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become evident, for the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire. And the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. And if any man's work which he has built on it remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet as through fire. Do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are." Now, we have a lot here, but Paul has a primary focus as he's going through this section, and that is that God is the one who brings results now. So don't worry about the messenger. Don't worry about the one working. And if you are the one working, don't worry about the results. Worry about the effort. He starts with that, as we were kind of looking at last week. Stop looking at the messengers. As the church, as the individual who's listening to the teaching, who is the one being poured into, stop looking at the messenger. What is Apollos? What is Paul? Just servants. Now, I think this passage applies equally to the church in general, but also to every individual. Starting with the church is never meant to be a one-man show. I know I'm kind of doing that this morning, the one-man band up here, but that's not the goal. That's not the intent, and as a church, we don't put that forward. Those leaders in the church is always meant to be a plurality of elders. The church coming together and several men being put forward to lead the church, to teach the church, to guide the church. And it happens as well in the life of an individual. No individual is a believer simply because of one voice pouring into them. There may be somebody who brought you to Christ, someone who taught you the basic things of the faith, someone who challenges you to go further, someone who counsels you during hard times, maybe an accountability partner, someone who stands beside you to hold you up through life. There are many different voices, and we should never elevate one person to the highest position. We should never have one person as a prime example, or the only especially example in our lives. There's a great danger in elevating somebody to that place of authority, that place of just ultimate teacher in our life for a number of reasons. One, the first is that Christ should be the only one that holds that position. The servant is just that, a servant, a messenger, as we've seen, a tool that is used by God, a conduit for His Spirit to pour into our life. We need to see Christ and Him crucified as our foundation, and as our only example to follow ultimately. Not to say that we shouldn't highlight certain teachers. Of course, God has gifted different people in different ministries. But we highlight them not because of who they are, but because how God has gifted them. We hold them up not because of who they are, but because they hold fast to the biblical truth. And that they're an example of that truth being lived out. We don't hold them up because of the effect of their ministry. Just because they have a huge church of 50 or 60 doesn't mean that they're any greater than the church of, what are we at, 25? The point is that we look at their faithfulness and service, not at the result of their work. And we do also, as Paul is pointing to here, have different jobs to do. God has gifted us in different ways. We're going to look at that later on in chapters 12 to 14 as we look at the spiritual gifts. But Paul says, I planted, or later, I laid the foundation. Paul was a church planter, an evangelist. That's what he did. Moving from one town to another. He never spent more than 3 years in one place. And that was in Ephesus. The second longest that he ever stayed in one city was in Corinth, and that was 1.5 years. Paul was very good at coming into a new place where there wasn't a church, going to the synagogue, preaching the truth to the Jews, and when some accepted and eventually the rest rejected him, going to the Gentiles, starting the church, and then sending somebody else in afterwards to continue the work of building, of watering. In Corinth, it was Apollos. We see him in different places sending men like Titus or Timothy to continue to build up the church. And no matter our gifting, God is going to use us for His purposes. And we shouldn't highlight one person's particular gifting over another because God uses us in different ways. Paul isn't better than Apollos was because he was the planter. He was the one who laid the foundation. And we need to understand ultimately that no matter how we serve, it is God that causes the growth. Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. God is the only one who builds. Only God chooses how to use our service, how to grow the kingdom or the church, how to grow the individual that we're ministering to. The effect or the change now lies only in the hands of God. You can be the most effective according to the world's standards. Be the most charismatic in your teaching. Be the most perfect in your presentation, your logical arguments. It will make no difference if God is not doing the work. You can be horrible at it. Stumble through the sermon. Mess up your terms, get them backwards, have to constantly be flipping back and forth through your notes, and God use you to great effect. Paul says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. So, again, the messenger is not the focus. He who plants and he who waters are one. If we're serving God, then we have the same goal, the same focus in mind, the glory of God. We can't hold up one person over another, no matter what kind of service they are performing, what kind of gifting God has given to them. And we need to focus all of our praise, all of our glory on God and God alone when it comes to the working of His Spirit in the world. Jesus is the one who said, I will build my church. Christ is both the builder and the foundation. As Paul points to, starting in verse 10, switching from that planting picture to that of building. I laid the foundation, but the foundation is Christ. And there is no other foundation in verse 11. For no man can lay a foundation other than the one which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. That really is an allusion to all of what Paul has been saying from chapter 1, verse 10 up until now. Looking at those different worldly philosophies, those different systems, the idea of the wise or the powerful man. Christ is the only foundation. We can't look to the world. We can't look to an individual. Don't worry about the messenger. Christ is the focus. As Paul said, I came to preach nothing among you but Christ and Him crucified. That is the foundation. That's the foundation that every church should be built on. And if it's not built on that, then it's not a church. Paul laid the foundation, preaching Christ and Him crucified. Apollos built on that, as did Titus and Timothy and their different churches. But ultimately, Paul's focus in verses 10 to 15 is this idea of the individual being rewarded for his service, not the result that happens in earth. Each will receive his own reward, Paul says in verse 8. We need to understand that it is God who does the work of growing the church or growing the individual. And the reward is for the work, not the result. God is not concerned with the earthly result of our service because He's the only one that brings the growth. He's the only one that brings the result. I've seen this many times over in things like counseling, where I've spent hours upon hours upon hours with an individual in counseling, pointing them to the truth, calling them to understand why or how their sin is affecting their heart, affecting their life, affecting the problem that they came to me with. Pouring my life into them to see nothing happen, to see nothing change. If anything, to see them pull further and further away from God. But that, to me, is not a failure of my service. Not a failure in that sense. My success or failure isn't measured in their response before God. My success or failure comes to the attitude and the faithfulness of my work. As I said before, the same is true for the sermon. Ultimately, I preach for an audience of one. My main concern Sunday afternoon is not, was I clear, are lives going to be changed because of what I presented, but was God approving of the work and the effort that I put into this sermon this week, the preparation that I had, the focus that I had? Was I diligent, approved by God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth? But that's not just for the pastor, not just for the counselor, not just for the evangelist. That applies in every aspect of our life. The individual that you've been praying for their salvation for years upon years. Your work in witnessing into the life of somebody else. Preaching the word through your actions and when you have opportunity in presenting the truth. The child that you're training up in God's word. Or in any area of service to God. We are rewarded for any service and every service, not just those that present with earthly results. Those things that often happen behind the scenes, like making meals, cleaning bathrooms. God rewards the heart and the attitude. The same applies even to our secular job. Just because we're not working in a church doesn't mean that we are not doing that job for God. In fact, Paul makes that very thing clear in Colossians chapter 3 as he's speaking to slaves. He says, "Slaves, in all things obey those who are your earthly masters, not with an external service, as those who merely please men, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of an inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve." He's speaking to slaves who have nothing to build of their own, nothing to call the results of their work other than what is their master's. And the same is true with us in our lives. In any aspect, any service that we have, any job that we are doing, we can do for God. And the results come because of our service to God, not the results of earthly things. Paul lays out this idea of a building, our service as a building. He says in verse 12, "Now if any man builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw, each man's work will become evident, for the day will show it, because it is to be revealed with fire. And the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work." Using this picture of building, he's saying, what kind of building material are you going to use that is going to be tested by fire? Wood, hay, straw is a building material. It is the result of putting things together, but when the fire comes, it's going to be consumed. Or are you building with gold and silver and precious stones? Are you making your building, your service out of granite, something that will last for eternity, or something that will fall apart? And the focus here is on the how and the why and the what. The how is the theology. The why is the attitude. The what is what it is that we're actually doing in our service, how accurately it falls in lines with God's commands, God's principles in what we're doing. Understand that our eternal reward, those building materials that we are using, comes down to these truths. We need to understand, as Paul has been pointing to, the true theology, the true foundation of our faith. Our theology, in fact, informs our love for God and for others, and it drives it. Bad theology is always going to lead to bad motivations and bad actions. If you don't understand how you are to love God, how you are to love others, then no earthly definition of love is ever going to suffice. And yet at the same time, you can have the most perfect theology, the best understanding of Scripture, but if you have no love, that theology is worthless. The how, the why, and the what determines, in that sense, the material, that heavenly material that's being used. The gold, the silver building materials adorned with precious stones is the right understanding of what God has called us to, the right theology and the right love for others, not the earthly results, the eternal attitudes that are there. Or are you doing those same work of service in the wrong theology, the wrong attitude, building for eternity, but building with wood, hay, and straw that ultimately will be burned away. Because ultimately our work will become evident. Picture all of your life's work building this building. And before God, it's brought out and set before you. And an angel comes and lays a torch to the side of it. Even the greatest Christians are going to have some wood, hay, and straw bits. Times where their heart just wasn't in the service. When their desire wasn't there, they were simply going through the motions. And the worst Christians, the lazy, the unintentional, will have those times of gold and silver, not because of themselves, but because of Christ working in them. But imagine that building of yours being set to the torch. That all of the extra stuff is burned away. And when it finally finishes its burning, the angel comes by with a leaf blower to push all the ash out of the way. What's going to be left? A grand building built of straw coming down to nothing. Or a great cathedral ordained or adorned with gold and silver and precious stones that lasts through all. That's the picture that Paul wants us to have. I think there are going to be a great many great men of the faith. People that many have looked through now and through the ages. The great ministries, the huge churches, the great work of evangelism that they supposedly did. And ultimately what's going to happen is that when that work is put before them, it comes to nothing because they were doing all of that out of vanity. Doing all of that out of selfishness, out of pride. And I think there are going to be far more of the quiet people. The ones that worked diligently in the background. That never had any accolades, never had any worldly effect, as some might see it. Who will present that great cathedral. To have this beautiful monument. All are bringing these to God. When the fire finishes its work, ultimately the picture is that of one who receives this reward that they can turn and give it back to God in glory and honor to Him. So the question is, what kind of offering are you going to bring? What kind of offering are you bringing before God? He's going to burn away the worthless stuff. God won't accept the wood and the straw. He's looking for the best that you have. Paul is speaking in this idea of the minister building up the church, but this applies to everyone. And finally, he gives this last warning here in verses 16 and 17, and I'm just going to hit them real quick. Do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? And if any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. Drawing into this overall theme of the fractious church, the ones who are splitting up the church. I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, I am of Christ. The arguing and the fighting, driven by their passions, driven by their infantile look at life, their spiritual fleshiness, rather than being of Christ. Warning the people. First, I think it's worth noting in verse 16, do you not know that you are the temple of God? That's why I love the Texas y'all. Well, I lived in Texas all of those years. I never used it. I started only using the word y'all later in life when I came to realize the importance of having a second person plural. That's the difference between you as in you and you as in all of you. That's what the word y'all means. That's why I use it. And here, this is what Paul is saying. Do y'all not know? Everyone that he's speaking to in Corinth. The church, y'all, you people, are the temple of God. And that the Spirit of God dwells in y'all. The church is not a building. The church is the people. And the Spirit of God dwells within the church. The holy ones, the saints. And in verse 17, he gives a warning. If any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy. That is what you are. I think this is a warning both for the infiltrator, the unbeliever that comes in, and there are people who do that. There was just a book written not too long ago titled Pastors for Sale. The whole focus of this book was the left, the people with the money on the left who want to see the church corrupted, want to see left-wing ideas infiltrating the church, drawing the people of God away from our true foundation and into the things like social justice and climate change. There are infiltrators who work their way into the church, presenting themselves as godly people, presenting themselves as those with good intentions, as believers who care nothing about Christ or his people, but have their own goals. And he's warning the infiltrators, but I think he's also warning the fractious believer. The believer who's acting like a child, the believer who's still acting like the fleshly man. The one who comes in still controlled by their pride, still controlled by their own desires, and creates strife and problems. On either side of that verse that we looked at already, 2 Timothy 2:15, verses 14 and 16 says this: remind them of these things, and solemnly charge them in the presence of God not to wrangle about with words which are useless and leads to the ruin of its hearers. But be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, accurately handling the word of truth, and avoid worldly and empty chatter, for it will lead to further ungodliness. People love to major on the minors, and the reason they do that so often is simply out of pride, focusing on their worldly philosophy, bringing in such problems, bringing in these fractures into the church for their own selfish reasons. Paul warns Titus in Titus chapter 3, reject a fractious man after a first and second warning, knowing that such a man is perverted and is sinning, being self-condemned. There is a time and a place to work through the so-called minor details, the little things in theology that so often lead to bigger things later on. But we need to do it in the right attitude and in the right way and in the right time to deal with those sort of issues, and making sure that our pride, making sure that our selfishness is not leading those kind of conversations. And Paul makes a fairly dire warning for the one who destroys the temple, the one who brings in that fracturing nature will be destroyed. How are you treating God's temple? So, with that, our first discussion question for this morning. Going back towards the beginning, God is the one who causes the growth. Why should we continue to pursue evangelism and ministry, knowing that only God has the ability to cause growth? If God is the only one ultimately responsible for the earthly results, why do we continue to pursue evangelism and ministry?
Because he needs us to help him.
He needs us to help him.
Right.
Didn't you mention that it was because we were just conduit, so he has to do it through us?
That's what I mean.
Or it's a way of doing it, like through us?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we are the conduit. We are the tool that he so often uses. I wouldn't go so far as to say he needs our help, but
Yeah, I meant, that's
it's
what I
the
meant.
same idea. Yeah, absolutely. We are the tool that God uses, the conduit that he works through. Why else do we continue to pursue evangelism and ministry, knowing that the earthly results are out of our hands?
Well, it helps us to grow too.
It helps us to grow too.
I mean, what Paul says about having a reason for your faith, being ready to give an explanation, while he's saying that, so that, be ready to explain to people why you believe what you believe. Well, it might be, you might get kind of complacent or lazy and not fully develop those things, and then all of a sudden you get in this situation where, why do I believe this? And like a crisis of faith kind of situation. So I think when we have that in our mind to be serving others and being able to explain, what the Bible says, at that moment it might be so that we can help somebody else, but it eventually will be that's helpful to us too as individuals.
Yeah. So much of our effort in ministry or in evangelism ultimately helps us to grow. I've seen that especially in things like counseling. That's why I'm a firm believer everyone should go through at least track 1 of the ACBC counseling stuff, so that you can, at the very least, know how your own heart begins to work. You can self-diagnose. And doing that's going to help you to grow. When you start to look at helping others, you're going to grow. Anybody else? Why should we continue to pursue evangelism ministry, even knowing that God is the one who brings the growth? Because God uses us as that tool, as that conduit, because it helps us to grow. Why else?
As kind of an extension of being a conduit, the means which God uses is in Romans 10 saying that people are saved through the hearing of the gospel, and it can only be heard as it's preached. Excuse me, and not just as a pastor when I'm standing up in front, but as Christians telling people of the gospel and what all God has done, not just through the person of Christ, but as that has continued to impact history, and as that continues to impact the church now. People are saved by the hearing of the word, and that needs to be said and heard.
Yeah, recognizing that you said God needs our help. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say needs our help, but what's even more amazing is that God, in that sense, uses us and only uses us. And so if we don't do it, who else is going to do it? If we don't preach, as CJ was getting to, who else is going to go? How can they believe in one they've not heard? And how can they hear unless someone preaches? It's such a privilege that we have to be that tool in God's hand. I think as well we recognize that, one, it's a command from God. If we are a believer, he has told us to pursue evangelism, to pursue ministry. And so we should do it in following God's command, but at the same time knowing that that is our joy. What a privilege it is, what a joy it is to be used by God. Even if there is no earthly result, it should be our joy to serve him, especially in preaching his truth and teaching those and serving those around us. So the second one, though, is the outgrowth of that. How does knowing that God rewards the effort, not the outcome, affect our mindset in ministry and evangelism? Recognizing this truth that we can plant or we can water, we can try to lay a foundation, but it's only God that grows, only God that brings the earthly result. How does knowing that affect our service? Knowing that God rewards effort, not result.
I've heard it explained as running on dirty or clean fuel. So if you're only worried about the outcome, you maybe want to cut corners or do questionable things to get to that. That would be dirty fuel. Be willing to give up things that, or compromise on things that you shouldn't compromise on because you're so focused on the end result. So but if we know that God is rewarding our process and our effort and not the outcome, then that keeps us focused on Him and not compromising or cutting corners.
Yeah, absolutely. If we're looking for that worldly result, we may start cutting corners. We may start looking for worldly solutions. But if we know that our ultimate reward is in heaven and that God rewards the effort, not the result, then it's going to keep us focused on the right things.
It should help us to be more patient.
Absolutely.
And less discouraged, like frustrated or those kind of things.
Yeah, it helps us to be patient in those times where we're pouring ministry, pouring effort into somebody or some part of the ministry of the church, week after week, month after month, even year after year, not seeing earthly results. We can be patient. It takes time. Cannot be discouraged, all right? This is what God is calling me to. And I'm going to keep doing it even though I don't necessarily see any change.
I think along with that is that there's quite a bit in the Bible talking about living faithfully. The focus is all faithful. Did we work faithfully, minister faithfully? Did we wait faithfully? Did we struggle faithfully? Did we rest faithfully? It's always on that focus of faith and knowing that, God in control, and we're not going to stand before Him. Then He's going to ask, well, hey, how many people did you convert? But He's going to ask, how faithful were you in that? And so you don't get worn out. You don't get, I think you talked, why burnout happens is because we're not getting the result we want. And so we can kind of take that step back and trust that God is handling all of this and He knows like the procedure of it, and we can just focus on how did I handle that situation in accordance to Scripture.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's so often how burnout happens in ministry is you can work really hard, really long hours when you're seeing the results that you want. It's easy to sacrifice when you see, the ministry is growing and exploding. It's really hard to work with that same sort of effort when you're not seeing the results. That's where people get burnt out. But the question is, going back to what Naomi said, are you serving with patience that keeps you from getting discouraged? Because you're serving not for the earthly results, but for that heavenly reward. I think this is such an important concept to keep in mind. Both this idea of we don't want to elevate the servant. We don't want to elevate the messenger only insofar as they are diligently handling the Word of God and being an example of Christian service, so that we don't get sucked into that cult of personality that so often grows within the church. And at the same time, we need to work with diligence, work with intent, and we can have patience. We can not be discouraged, recognizing that ultimately all of our effort will be rewarded in eternity, not necessarily now, and that should be our focus.